I live in a small rural town in the northern part of Michigan. Almost every single store is owned by someone's family and has been for generations. That's why people were surprised when, a bit over a month ago, a Chinese buffet opened up suddenly. The closest to foreign foods we had around here was a Taco Bell at 3 miles outside of town. So the prospect of getting to try something new enticed a lot of people around the area. A few days after it first opened is when I first heard the raves about it. I'm telling you, Charlie, you gotta try out that new buffet over on Jefferson Street. I think it's called Kwang Tung Buffet or something. The food is mighty good. My neighbor Jerry told me. His whole family was unloading from their sedan and they all looked like they ate themselves sick. Everybody was walking sluggish and holding their stomachs. Sorry, Jerry, but buffets have never really been my thing. I just get weirded out by the idea of food sitting out all day. I replied to him, trying not to stare at the bizarre sight happening behind him. Nah, I'm telling you, Charlie, this place is incredible. I've never tasted food like it. It was so rich and flavorful. Hell, me and the missus have already made plans to go back later this week on date night, he said with a big toothy grin. He still had pieces of chicken stuck in his teeth like he couldn't have been bothered to chew and swallow properly. The sight of his teeth made me feel queasy, so I quickly made my exit. I wasn't doubting that the place was good for a Chinese buffet, but still, no food is good enough to eat yourself sick. Within a week, any desire to go to Kwang Tung Buffet was gone. It seemed like it was all anybody was talking about anymore. At work, I'd hear people discussing going there on lunch, or talking about the new menu items I just had to try. At home, it seemed like the commercials played nonstop. Even when I would talk to my neighbors, they almost always tried to direct the conversation to the damn place. It was all anybody could ever think about. By week 2, it seemed like people were going there for hours at a time and still leaving with carry-out boxes absolutely stuffed. Thanks to this, the whole town began to smell like stale sweet and sour sauce and rotting sushi. Yet despite the smells and the obvious stress people were putting on themselves by eating there so much, Kwang Tung seemed to be doing more business than ever. The parking lot was overflowing at almost all hours of the day and people just kept talking about it more and more. I did my best to stay out of everyone's business. Who was I to tell my neighbors and coworkers where to eat? Yeah, it seemed extreme just how much and how often they were eating there, but still, not my business. Week 3 and hardly anyone was even at the grocery store anymore. Even though they only had 2 cash registers open on a Saturday, there still wasn't a line when I did my weekly shopping. So, why aren't you at Kwang Tung like everyone else? The 17-year-old cashier asked me, smacking her gum. I'm not really a fan of buffets, I guess, I said, trying to get the awkward conversation over as fast as possible. Oh, well, more for me then. I'm going there the second I get off work. I heard they have peach buns now and I can't wait to try them, she said as she licked her lips and drool fell onto her chin. Yeah, have fun with that, I responded with a half-hearted smile as I grabbed my few bags and quickly made my way out. As I was making my way home, yet another ad for Kwang Tung Buffet came over the radio. You've all been demanding it and we've finally listened. Introducing the new hours at Kwang Tung Buffet. We will now be open 24/7, 365 days a year. Why wait for our delicious mouth-watering meals when you can have them whenever you want? The man screamed across the radio waves. Great. Now people won't even leave that place, I said to myself. A few days later, Jerry asked me if I could watch his family's dog, Cujo, for the next week or so. They were all going on a trip and couldn't take him along. I agreed, and later that evening he dropped the mutt off at my house and him and his wife and kids headed out. It was only after they left that I realized he hadn't given me any dog food or toys. I grabbed the spare key he had given me when I first moved in and let myself in to grab Cujo's stuff. The place was a mess. There was Kwangtung takeout boxes littering every inch of the floor, and the whole place reeked of rotting food. Plates were piled up in the sink, still sticky with sauce and juices. How the hell was Jerry and his family living in this filth? I had been over to Jerry's many times before, and the place was always immaculate. There wasn't even a speck of dirt near the front door, so to see his house like this now was a complete shock. I felt terrible that Cujo had to live in this as well. The poor dog was stuck here all day in the filth when everybody else left to go to work or school. A few days later, I was out running errands and had to drive past the godforsaken buffet. That's when I noticed Jerry's blue sedan in the parking lot. I was confused since I figured they'd still be gone for a few more days, so I tried to call him up to see if something happened and they came back to town early. No response. He was probably too busy shoving mounds of crab rangoon and General Tso's chicken into his mouth to answer his phone. I figured I'd see them later that night though and talk to Jerry about how disgusting his house was then. Midnight rolled around and still no sign of anybody at his house. Maybe I was mistaken and somebody else had the same car in town as Jerry. It wasn't completely impossible, right? Then a few days later, I found myself driving past Kwangtung again, only to see the same blue sedan in the same exact parking spot, like it hadn't ever left. In fact, it looked like all the cars were in the exact same spot as before. I again tried phoning Jerry and again got no answer. Confused, I decided to pull into the parking lot. The smell of fish and chicken was so thick that I could almost taste it, even in my car. I opened the door to Kwangtung and was hit with a stench so strong I almost vomited right there. It was like a mixture of BO, Old Chinese, and bile. Along with the smell, there was a strange sopping sound, like someone hitting raw meat coming from inside. I covered my nose and entered the foul dining room. Inside was horrifying. The place was packed with people shoveling as much food as possible into their gullets, staring at each other blankly. Their stomachs were stretched to the absolute limit. Vomit soaked their shirts and seats, yet they didn't seem to notice. They just kept eating. That's when I noticed what exactly they were eating. A number of people were hunched over in their chairs, passed out I presumed. Then I noticed their stomachs. It looked like they were completely ruptured from how much food they had eaten. Worse yet though was when I saw someone absent-mindedly reach down under the table to pull the dead's organs out onto the tabletop. They began to squeeze their stomach and intestines, juices spraying everywhere, and I saw chunks of partially digested food fall out onto the others' plates. The people would then lick their lips, drool dripping from their mouths, and begin eating the food they just scavenged from the others' insides. I could feel the bile rise from my stomach and there was no way I could hold it in any longer. I threw up right there. Everybody in the buffet immediately stopped what they were doing and stared at me. It looked like they were checking me over and a few of them moved closer. I started to back away when I noticed the cashier girl from the grocery store crawling on the ground, sniffing the air. She was still wearing her work uniform over the exact same clothes I had seen her in a few days ago, now soaked in sweat and sauce. She scrambled to my vomit and began rummaging through it, smelling and eating some of it before groaning and turning away. I ran out of the building and phoned the police. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew it wasn't right. A few minutes later, multiple police cars and ambulances showed up at Kwangtung. The people inside had to literally be dragged out screaming by the officers. 14 people were pronounced dead on the scene. They had either eaten till their stomachs burst or had been ripped apart by other patrons trying to get at whatever was inside them. Another 47 were taken to the hospital with serious internal injuries. At the end, a small family was taken out in handcuffs, the apparent owners of Kwangtung. Jerry was one of the people found dead. He had apparently eaten himself to death the day after I last saw him. His wife and kids sat there idly eating their food for the next week as he rotted beside them. Eventually, they even turned to eating the remains inside his stomach. Over the next few days, the remainder of the patrons all had to be checked into rehab. They were all refusing to eat anything, just screaming for more food from Kwangtung. When they were brought into questioning, the owners of Kwangtung claimed they didn't know why the people were so obsessed with their food. They didn't mean harm, but they were afraid of what might happen if they stopped feeding them. Customers had threatened to kill them and their family if they ever stopped serving their amazing food. They were just keeping up with demand. All they ever wanted was to run a successful buffet.